There's a forgotten version of Marks & Spencer that exists in the memory of almost every British person today. A place where the food was better than it had any right to be, where the clothes lasted for years, where the label said St. Michael, and it meant something quality, reliable, and a certain kind of pride. For over a century, M&S wasn't just a shop, it was a benchmark. And then, slowly, it started to come apart. Today, we're going back to the era of St. Michael labels, of food halls that felt like a reward, and of a high street institution that British people trust almost without thinking to find out exactly how it all went wrong. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the decline of M&S wasn't really about retail. It was about something much harder to get back once it's gone. Here's what happened. What M&S actually was. Picture this. It's 1985, you walk into your local M&S on a Saturday morning. The food hall smells like fresh bread and coffee, and the lighting is warm. You reach for a jumper and the label says St. Michael. You don't check the fabric content, you just put it in the basket. Because St. Michael means it's good. It always has been. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. The story began in 1884 when Michael Marks, a Leeds market stall trader, partnered with Thomas Spencer, a cashier from Skipton. Together, they laid the groundwork for what would become a British institution. However, the partnership was cut short by their deaths. Spencer died in 1905 and Marks in 1907. In 1916, the leadership passed to Michael's son, Simon Marks. While the company had already begun to evolve significantly before he took the helm, Simon became the architect of the brand's golden era. In 1928, Simon registered the St. Michael brand name partly as a tribute to his father and partly as a guarantee. The idea was that if it carried that label, it met the M&S standard. And by 1950, virtually every product in every M&S store carried it. They made sure you weren't choosing between brands. You were choosing M&S and trusting that they'd already done the choosing for you. For decades, that trust was completely earned. M&S made its reputation on selling almost exclusively British-made goods, building long-term relationships with British manufacturers, and becoming the country's biggest clothing retailer. And in 1998, it became the first British retailer to post a pre-tax profit of over £1 billion. That was the peak. What happened next is the part nobody saw coming. The year 1998 wasn't just a record profit, it was the last good year. After Simon Marks died in 1964, several people led the company. Through the 1970s and 80s, M&S wasn't just growing, it was redefining what a British retailer could be. In 1973, it expanded into Canada, and 2 years later, stores opened in Paris and Lyon, and then Ireland followed in 1979. By the mid-80s, M&S had a footprint across continental Europe, and it was beginning to look like something genuinely global. Back in Britain, it became the first supermarket in 1980 to sell packaged sandwiches. Demand was so high that it had to industrialize the supply chain from scratch. Then other supermarkets followed. By 1990, the British sandwich industry alone was worth £1 billion. M&S had created an entire market category. In 1988, it acquired the American clothing institution Brooks Brothers and King's Food Markets in the United States. It was hiring a food expert to overhaul its cake ranges. M&S was also among the first retailers to introduce sell-by dates and ban smoking in its stores in 1959, decades before it became a law. Every single one of these moves said the same thing. This is a company that knows exactly what it is and exactly where it is going. But under CEO Sir Richard Greenberry, profit margins had been pushed to levels that were simply not sustainable. Customer loyalty, the thing M&S had spent a century building, was being quietly eroded, and the company was rejecting any credit card except its own store charge card. This was awkward because the world was already in an era where every other retailer on the high street was making it easier to spend money, but M&S was making it harder. In 2000, M&S phased out the St. Michael brand entirely. 72 years of brand equity, a name millions of British people had grown up trusting, was replaced with a generic Marks & Spencer label that said essentially nothing. These decisions made the profit collapse from over £1 billion in 1998 to just £145 million by March 2001. This wasn't an occasional company dip, it was a free fall. This made M&S finally accept credit cards in 2002, 3 years after the damage had been done. The identity crisis, fashion. Then they launched Per Una, a new fashion range designed by George Davies. This was because of the arrival of fast fashion brands like H&M, Zara, and Topshop. M&S began rebuilding the business model from scratch, and honestly, the profit increased slightly, enough to be called a turnaround. In 2004, Philip Green, the man behind Arcadia and BHS, launched a takeover bid. The fact that one of Britain's most aggressive corporate raiders looked at M&S and saw an opportunity says everything about how vulnerable the company had become. M&S fought back to regain its former height in the market. One of their recovery plans was selling their financial services arm to HSBC, buying Per Una, closing the Gateshead Life Store, and stopping the expansion of Simply Food stores. Philip Green withdrew after he didn't get sufficient backing from shareholders. Was the M&S we remember really as untouchable as we thought? Or had the cracks been there for longer than anyone was willing to admit? Because what comes next suggests the problem wasn't just fashion, it was everywhere. The food hall problem. The food hall was where M&S got complicated because on the surface, the food was still good. But as costs of living rose, the gap between M&S prices and other brands like Tesco and Sainsbury's began to feel less like a quality premium and more like an access barrier. By 2019, M&S recognized this directly. They announced plans for supermarket-sized food halls to attract families doing a weekly shop, and they lowered the price of over 1,000 popular lines to compete with larger rivals. That wasn't a strategy. It was a contradiction of the name they were trying to regain. The Percy Pig problem. Percy Pig first appeared in 1992. These were small gummy sweets, raspberry and strawberry flavored, all made in Germany. They were a nice thing to pick up while shopping. It felt special because you could only get them at M&S. By the late 2000s, Percy had become a phenomenon, generating over £10 million in UK sales in a single year and genuine cultural cachet recognized across the industry, reportedly featured on British Vogue's Hot List. And then M&S did what large companies often do with something beloved. They scaled it. Percy Pig became clothing, homeware, toys, biscuits, birthday cakes, gin and tonic, a Christmas advert voiced by Tom Holland, and a giant fiberglass statue on a rooftop in Stevenage. At some point, Percy stopped being a product people loved and became a brand M&S was leaning on because of its emotional equity. You cannot simultaneously make a product feel special and put it on everything. The store closures. In 2018, M&S announced it would close more than 100 stores by 2022. In May 2019, that number increased to 120. Then in 2021, another 30 branches were confirmed for closure, with a further 80 earmarked for relocation merger. In 2022, 67 more. In 2023, confirmation of 110 additional closures with 5 new flagship stores announced in 5 major cities. The company's own chairman, Archie Norman, was unusually candid about what had caused it. It's simple. The company had been drifting and under-fulfilling its promise not for 5 years, or 10, but for 15 years. The closure of the first 14 stores put 600 jobs at risk, and then closing 100 stores would put approximately 4,300 jobs at risk. And this was before the pandemic changed everything. In the financial year ending April 2021, M&S recorded a pre-tax loss of over £200 million, with sales in clothing and food both down significantly. The human cost of these numbers is not abstract. These were people who had, in many cases, built careers inside M&S. Before all this, the company had historically prided itself on staff welfare, canteen benefits, chiropody services, and treating its employees as part of an institution worth belonging to. Then there is the effect on the high street itself. It is harder to quantify, but arguably caused more damage in the long run. At its peak, M&S operated over 900 stores across the UK. M&S was not just a retailer in most of those towns. It was what retail specialists call an anchor store. And when the anchor leaves, the ecosystem around it destabilizes. In Putney, South London, the M&S store had been a local fixture since 1931. When it closed in 2018, the site sat vacant for years. By 2020 and 2021, Putney High Street was filled with empty units, and the unused M&S shell was the most visible symbol of the decline. A local campaign, Save the High Street, was launched in 2022. Residents, councillors, and community groups met to discuss what had been lost and whether it could be recovered. Putney is one example, but the same story played out in town after town across Britain. In Wakefield, the closure of the Kirkgate M&S was described locally as a disaster and a major blow to a city centre which was already under enormous pressure. The stores didn't close because M&S ran out of ideas. They closed because too many of the ideas that came before had quietly hollowed out the thing people had actually come for, which is trust. And trust is not something you recover with a rebrand or a rooftop statue. And maybe that's the real reason we can't seem to let go of M&S. Not the food, not the clothes, not even the nostalgia, but because of what M&S represented, which is the idea that somewhere out there, a shop had made a promise to you and actually intended to keep